Welcome, everyone. Hello. You can see us. We can't see you, but we can see your names. We're very happy to have you here. I am Huri Berberian. I'm professor of history and the Merouni Family Presidential Chair in Armenian Studies. This is our first of two virtual events this quarter. The second will be held on May 28th as a conversation between my co-author, Professor Talin Grigor, who is professor and chair of art history at UC Davis, and me, and it will be moderated by Dr. Talar Shahinian, also at UCI. I hope very much that you and your loved ones are faring well in these challenging and trying times. Keeping healthy, safe, and sane as well, which is very important during these days as we bunker together. Bunker, hunker, I'm not sure which one it is. I'm happy to see that we are being joined by at least 29 people as of now, but apparently 53 people have RSVP'd, so that's very exciting and good news. So a bit about the format of the webinar before we begin. First of all, it will be recorded and made available on our YouTube channel. If you subscribe to that YouTube channel and we get over 100 subscriptions, it doesn't cost anything, YouTube doesn't bother you with emails, etc. Then we get our own channel name, UCI Armenian Studies, instead of the bunch of numbers and letters that currently are the UCI Armenian Studies label for the YouTube channel. So Dr. Gutman and I will have a conversation for about 40 minutes or so, after which you will take questions through the Q&A. So if you have a question, please type it in to Q&A. Once we are done with our conversation, I will begin to read the questions aloud to Dr. Gutman and our audience, and we will try to get to all of your questions, but I can't promise that we will. It all depends on the number of questions we have, but we will do our very best. So, to introduce Dr. David Gutman, it's such a pleasure to have you back, David, in a sense, although you're not physically at UC Irvine. We really appreciate that you were willing to speak with us again. I have to say that David was here in March. It was our last event. And it was the day that basically news came down that everything was going online, etc. So we were happy to have him there, and we are very pleased actually with the audience. There were so many students there and faculty as well, so I think we had quite a large audience, and that was heartwarming. So Professor David Gutman is an associate professor of history at Manhattanville College in Purchase, New York. He has published several articles and reviews on migration, mobility control, and the historiography of the Armenian genocide. The subject of our conversation is his first book, The Politics of Armenian Migration to North America, 1885 to 1915. Congratulations, David, on your first book. And he tells me that a paperback edition is coming soon, coming out in a few months. If you can't wait for the paperback edition, the hardcover edition is certainly available on online or at your local booksellers if you can get there. So the book, without going into much description, since we're going to be talking about it, looks at the history between 1885 to 1915, when several tens of thousands of Armenians migrated between the Ottoman Empire and North America. And he delves into a number of issues from Armenians being seen as a political threat to return migration from North America to the Ottoman Empire, smuggling, and so forth. All things that actually parallel in many ways the migratory experience of today. And those parallels are very compelling in the book as well. So and here's the book in case you want to take a look at the cover. So I will begin without further ado. Again, thank you, David. Welcome. So
Having me.
our pleasure. So how would you say is your book a departure from scholarship in Armenian, Ottoman, and migration studies? In other words, what sets it apart at the same time that it actually contributes to these fields?
Sure, and thank you again for having me. It's great to be back, even if it's back in virtual form. My goal here is to be as brief as possible, so you may see some holes in the areas that we're discussing. My goal is to have that open, have those spaces open for the question and answer period. As far as the contribution that I see the book making, I think exists on a number of fields. One is to broaden out the discussion of the Armenian experience, the Ottoman Armenian experience, outside of the context of the Armenian genocide, of the Hamidian massacres of the mid 1890s, to look at this period, right? This migration that I'm talking about is taking place between the mid 1880s to the beginning of World War I. So it's concurrent with this era of violence, of state persecution of Ottoman Armenians. But the effort here is to widen the scope beyond the kind of traditional narratives about the Armenian experience in the Ottoman Empire and globally in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And it's also an effort to, although it's a book about migration, it's also very much linked to the history of what we call the six Armenian provinces, Western Armenia, the Ottoman East, because this migration originates in not only broadly speaking, the Ottoman East, but in particular, the majority of Armenians who migrate to North America in this period are coming from in and around the area of Harput or Harpert in what is now central or eastern Turkey. So it's also a history in part of this particular place. And to answer the question, or to begin to answer the question, why is it that that this migration is not, it's not all Armenians throughout the empire, but rather the majority are coming from this particular region. So part of it is also trying to answer questions about, why this particular region? Why is there high rates of migration from this particular region? And what does that say about the diversity of historical experiences within this broader region that we call either Western Armenia, the Ottoman East, the names we often apply to it. And then another element, another layer to this too, is to, I would say, question a kind of narrative that has emerged within Ottoman history over the past 20 years, which is, I think, is rightly questioning the extent to which we kind of silo Ottoman experiences within or look at various experiences of Ottoman populations through the lens of ethnicity. So that, over the past 20 years, Ottoman historians working broadly on the late Ottoman Empire have tried to challenge this notion that Ottoman populations experienced this period, the late Ottoman Empire, solely or largely through the lens of ethnic identity. And I think this literature has been very important in trying to challenge or trying to understand the many different ways in which Ottoman populations, Middle Eastern populations experienced the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But I see in my book, the reason why I focus specifically on Armenian migrants. And when I had the book grows out of my dissertation. And in the dissertation, I tried to avoid coming to grips with the fact that really this is an Armenian story, and that's significant. Because in fact, while it's important not to assume that everybody experiences history solely through the lens of ethnic identity, at the same time, these categories of identity were nonetheless extremely significant. And we can't overcorrect and essentially erase the fact that Ottoman populations did at the same time interface with the Ottoman state. They did through the lens or through these categories of identity. and the fact that Armenians and the experience of migration, both leaving the Ottoman Empire and returning to the Ottoman Empire, were heavily shaped by the fact that the Ottoman state viewed Armenians as a very particular political threat and sought specifically to prevent their mobility, both leaving and coming back. And that shaped how Armenians migrated, how they moved, how they traveled across borders. And I think that's very significant to understand that, not to erase that, not to avoid the fact that at the same time, as we again challenge this notion that, that people lived in this empire siloed into these particular sort of ethnic boxes, that we not overcorrect and ignore the fact that nonetheless these categories were significant, were important, and did shape people's experiences in a very particular way. And I think broadly, this is an effort, the book is also an effort to bring an understudied area into the historiography of global migration, to understand that the experiences of Armenian migrants, the efforts of the Ottoman state as well as the United States to control, to respond to this mobility, has also a global historical significance. So this isn't just a parochial study of a small chapter in this broader history of the migrations, global migrations of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, but rather this story, this example has specific importance for how we understand this history of global migrations in this period more broadly.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You mentioned, David, Harput in particular, the migration out of Harput. Why Harput? And who are these Armenians who are migrating, and why are they migrating?
Right. So as I mentioned, especially before the so-called Young Turk Revolution of 1908, and the reason why that's an important shifting point in my book is that before 1908, this is under the autocratic rule of Sultan Abdulhamid II, the Ottoman state, beginning in the late 1880s, officially banned Armenians from migrating, the vast majority of Armenians from migrating to North America, as well as returning from sojourns in North America. And so because, again, the state tried to prevent people both from leaving and coming back, that limited who could move. So people had to migrate through these smuggling channels. And as a result, it also shaped or defined the kind of geography of migration, where people were leaving from. And so this is one thing that I grapple with in the book. The majority of people who leave between, especially the late 1880s and 1908, probably more than 60, 70% of the Armenians who migrate to North America in this period are coming from this area that I call the Hartford Region, which includes the city of Hartford and then the kind of government city of Mesre just down from it, and the neighboring villages like Huseinik and Parchenj, but also includes places a little bit further away like Palu, Keri, for those of you who know your geography of this region. So really about a 50-kilometer radius in and around the city of Harput Mesre. And the argument that I make here is that Armenian communities in and around Harput are generally more politically and economically stable than communities, say, further east in places like Bitlis or Van or Sassoon, that in the 1890s, for example, are feeling the full brunt of this campaign of persecution, of massacre, of violence, of double taxation, that have kind of been a stand-in for the Armenian experience as a whole in the Ottoman East in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. But my argument is that Harput is actually, although it does face a major pogrom in 1895, it is a scene of violence. It's not as extreme as what exists further east, and there is a degree of greater economic and political stability there that allows for people to take what is, in a sense, a major risk to migrate abroad, because for most migrants who leave, the intention is to eventually return. The idea is to go abroad, to work, earn some money, send money back, and eventually return either permanently or temporarily, whether that's to return permanently, invest in land, stay after return, or to return reunite with family, maybe get married, and eventually return to the United States. So return is sometimes, itself a multifaceted kind of phenomenon. But this is a very risky thing to do, to undertake. It's extremely expensive, especially having to migrate through these illicit channels as the Ottoman state attempts to prevent mobility. So again, it's people with some degree of means and people who are migrating from a place that is at least a degree more stable than and again, this is on a comparative basis, than especially communities further east, which are much more economically and politically unstable, in which undertaking the risk of migration would be that much more risky, that much more difficult.
Can you give us an example of a character or of a migrant that whose story you find particularly compelling? Someone who migrated to North America and then tried to return, perhaps.
Right. So, well, I could discuss briefly the person who's on the cover of the book, and
Yeah.
here again, I could bring it out. Uh, let's see, this person who's laying down right here. Thank you, Huri has it also. His name is Johannes Topalian. He actually from Gurun, which is a town not far from modern day Kayseri, south of Sebastia, Sivas, in central Anatolia. He left in 1891. And again, like many Armenian migrants in this period, he left as a single young male. He was about 19, 20 years old, with the intention of working for a while in the United States and returning. He landed in Providence, Rhode Island, or he ended up in Providence, Rhode Island, where he worked for several years. He naturalized as an American citizen in 1897. That next year, in 1898, he enlisted in the United States Army and went to Cuba, where he fought in the Spanish-American War. And that's what that image is of Johannes Topalian with his Spanish-American War buddies holding a probably martini rifle. He was honorably discharged after fighting in the Spanish-American War, and then returned to Gurun in 1901. After his father wrote to him and asked him to come back to marry, he returned. He married. He spent several years back home before deciding to return back to the United States with his family in tow. And perhaps what's most fascinating about his story, and again, why I think that the Armenian migrant experience in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is particularly important, particularly illustrative of the difficulties, of the challenges of migrating across borders, both in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And again, we can talk about this still being the case in the 21st century. Is that, again, he returned in 1901 when it was outlawed for Armenians who had migrated unlawfully abroad to return. So he had to return, essentially hiding the fact that he had migrated to the United States. So even though he had naturalized as an American citizen, when he arrived at port, he did not admit the fact that he had been in the United States. He did not present an American passport. He did not claim to be an American citizen because he realized, he knew that if he had done so, he would have been debarred at port, so he would not have been allowed to re-enter the empire. And because he did that, when he sought to return to the United States in 1907, he visited the U.S. consulate in Sivas, not far from his home community, hoping to get a passport. And he provided all sorts of evidence that he was in fact an American citizen. And his citizenship claim was denied by the U.S. consul in Sivas, on the basis that he had voluntarily forfeited his citizenship, his American citizenship, by having returned to the Ottoman Empire without having making the fact of his naturalization as an American citizen known to Ottoman authorities. And of course, again, it's important to remind here that he did that so he could return. Right? He knew that if he had made the fact of his citizenship known, that he likely would have been deported from the empire. So, he found himself in this bind, essentially stuck between the what I argue were the anti-immigrant policies of not one but two states, the Ottoman Empire and the United States. And as a result, he found himself, and not just him, I mean, many Armenians, hundreds, if not thousands, of Armenians found themselves who had returned to the Ottoman Empire in exactly this same kind of predicament where they were both the targets of anti-immigrant policies at the hands of the Ottoman state as well as the United States government. And again, we can get into a discussion of why that's the case in the Q&A session.
Um, you mentioned smugglers in one of your responses. So I'm curious about these smugglers. Who are they? What are these smuggling networks like? What did they smuggle before migrants? Or who are they? Who are the smugglers themselves? And how are they going about doing the job that they do or carrying out what they do? And where are they exactly?
Okay.
In the Ottoman Empire. Yeah.
So as I mentioned, beginning in the late 1880s, the Ottoman state officially outlawed Armenian migration to North America. And just as is the case in the contemporary period, when states put up barriers to migration, people find ways to skirt those barriers, right? They go through, if they can't migrate through licit channels, they migrate through illicit channels, through underground channels. That is not a byproduct of the contemporary period, right? Instead, this is a dynamic that has been at play at least since the late 19th century, if not well before that. That again, states erect barriers to movement and people find ways around those barriers. So one way that Armenian migrants bypassed this ban on migration to North America, how do you get from the interior, from the Hartford region to the coast, to the Mediterranean Sea coast or the Black Sea coast, and onto a ship that's going to take you eventually to a European transit port and then on to North America? It's through these very, very organized, very sophisticated, highly coordinated smuggling channels that begin to emerge in the late 1880s and into the 1890s that take people from these communities in the Ottoman interior to the Black Sea or the Mediterranean coast. By the early 20th century, people are being smuggled as far south as Beirut. So we're talking about distances of several hundred miles. So again, these migrant networks these smuggling networks are coordinated over vast stretches of space. And so they include a wide bevy of intermediaries, of people who are helping migrants along the way. So including one character that I talk about in the book is this very wealthy banker by the name of Artin Harputlian, who is probably one of the wealthiest people in the Hartford region, a very powerful banker in the region. He is a member of the Ottoman Provincial Council in the province of Mamret-ul Aziz, which is the province that the Harput Mesre is a part of. So he is, in a way, kind of integrated into the economic and political system of the region, but he's also a very highly successful, powerful migrant smuggler. So he sits at the top of this vast chain of connections that connect him all the way to New York and Boston. So these include Kurdish muleteers who help guide people along the path to whether it's Mersin or Iskenderun or Beirut, these places along the Mediterranean coast, where they then, once they reach the coast, will spend often weeks at a time in these boarding houses, awaiting for these networks of intermediaries in these coastal cities to arrange travel. So purchase tickets, arrange meetings with these boatmen who will sneak migrants onto ships, so in the middle of the night, out of these port cities and away from the watchful eye of state authorities who are trying to crack down on this mobility. So all of this, again, is heavily coordinated and linked to, again, these wide sets of intermediaries in these coastal cities. So again, these boarding houses often were owned by Armenians or Muslims from the Harput region, but they were connected to, again, boatmen, connected to ticket agents who would help them arrange the travel, arrange the tickets, connected to people who worked in these consulates, who had some degree of diplomatic immunity, and so therefore could help also arrange some of these connections. So again, these are very highly coordinated, very sophisticated systems working across vast stretches of space. And then they're also connected to people in these transit ports like Liverpool, Marseille, where there will also be boarding houses housing migrants who are staying for, again, weeks at a time, awaiting for passage across the Atlantic. And then, for example, Artin Harputlian's network, his brother lived in New York City and it appears was collecting on debts that migrants owed to Artin Harputlian, but back in the Hartford region, for the services, for these smuggling services, which were often quite expensive. I mean, adjusted for 21st century inflation, easily could cost $10,000-$15,000 to travel through these smuggling channels. And that goes back to that original point that I was making about how risky migration is, right? It's a hugely expensive endeavor, one that, if you make it to the United States and you make these relatively high wages compared to what could be earned in the Ottoman Empire, you could save a lot of money and send a lot of money back. But again, it's a huge risk just to get there to begin with because of having to migrate through these illicit channels.
Mhm. So are these smugglers smuggling anything other than humans? I mean, is this something they just got into, or have they been smuggling other things, and why not add humans to the portfolio, so to speak?
Right, so it's a mixture of both. These port city networks that become key nodes in these broader migrant smuggling networks are also, they're not just smuggling humans through these port cities, but also drugs, weapons. This is something that the Ottoman state itself is extremely worried about, the degree to which there is so much illicit traffic going through these port cities, and it certainly helps to have this infrastructure in place and tied into then these broader smuggling networks. And they also, although after 1908, when the Ottoman state lifts these regulations or these prohibitions on Armenian migration, it's no longer necessary after 1908 for Armenians to migrate through these smuggling channels. But what I found is that after the genocide, when survivors have returned to the Harput region, the kind of nascent Turkish Republic attempts to prevent is essentially applying similar kinds of mobility restrictions in the late 19 teens, early 1920s. And once again, I've heard, listening to some of these oral histories of survivors who lived in the region in the late 19 teens, early 1920s, is that these smuggling networks were once again essentially reactivated in the late 19 teens and early 1920s to help Armenians once again leave once they realized that the future looked quite difficult in the post-genocide Republic of Turkey.
Mhm. So, does the smuggling continue in the U.S.? Does it need to? I mean, is once they come, I assume they come illegally to the U.S. as well. Not only are they leaving illegally, but they come to the U.S.
So
illegally, and yeah.
So this is kind of the irony, and this is the reverse of the situation that you see in the present day.
Mm,
So while there are groups in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that are the targets
mhm,
of restriction, of course, most notably is Chinese restriction,
mhm,
Chinese exclusion, which is introduced in the early 1880s. And so Chinese who come to the United States after 1882, and particularly after the late 1880s, when these restrictions on Chinese migration are made especially strict, Chinese migrants do absolutely come in through the back door, come in unlawfully through smuggling networks operating from China, operating from Canada, as kind of restrictionist politics in the United States get increasingly strict in the early 20th century. So larger numbers of populations, including increasingly migrants from South and Eastern Europe and the Middle East, you do find increasing sort of unlawful migration especially coming into the second decade of the 20th century. But for the most part, these Armenian migrants come into the United States lawfully. There aren't major restrictions on Armenian in-migration or in-migration of other groups from the Middle East and Eastern and Southern Europe in the 1890s, in the first decade of the 20th century. So they're coming into the United States, if we could use the word here very loosely, lawfully. They're not great barriers on their coming into the United States. Rather, again, they're having to rely on these smuggling networks to leave, to get out of the Ottoman Empire. And so in that way, it's a reverse of the present period in which migrants rely primarily on smuggling networks and other illicit channels to bypass barriers on their in-migration. Nonetheless, the dynamics are very similar with one another, even though, again, the kind of order is reversed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The dynamics that drive the evolution and the function of these channels, these smuggling networks, at that time, 120 years ago, are very similar to, again, those dynamics that drive the evolution of these networks in the present period.
Interesting. Why would Armenian migrants return? I mean, of course, in hindsight, it was not a good idea, obviously, to return. They didn't know what was coming. They didn't know there was genocide coming. But what was the context or the factors that necessitated their return? Or, I mean, I assume they weren't all there for a temporary period of time. Some of them perhaps thought they would be staying longer and return.
Right. So, I think it's really important to emphasize that throughout this period, including after the Hamidian massacres of the mid-1890s, the vast majority of those who are migrating are young men. So even after the violence of the 1890s, of course, there are larger numbers of families who begin migrating after 1895 and 1896, but still the predominant dynamic are young men who are migrating, who are going abroad, leaving families, right? So we're talking about, men in their late teens, their 20s. Some may have just gotten married. Some are single. They're leaving parents behind. They're leaving young spouses behind. In some cases, young children behind, with the idea that, again, they're going to return. They're leaving their entire livelihoods, their family connections behind, to work in a strange place. This Robert Myrak famously wrote this book, Torn Between Two Lands, in the early 1980s. It sort of captures that concept, right? Of this is not, at least initially, a firm break with the homeland. And it's not only because, they pine for a kind of abstract notion of home, but also because their homes are still literally there, right? Their parents are there, their children are there, their spouses are there, their friends are there. So I'm careful to emphasize that, I don't distinguish when I'm trying to come up with the numbers and the estimate that I come at before 1908. There are more reliable numbers for the rate of return migration after 1908. That has nothing to do with the Young Turk Revolution. Rather, the United States government begins collecting reliable data on return migration for all migrant groups, beginning in 1908 and 1909. So we have pretty good numbers for the rate of Armenian return after 1908, which runs probably somewhere in the neighborhood of about 20 to 25% of those who leave eventually come back, either permanently or temporarily. Before 1908, I have some statistics, actually Ottoman statistics on return migration, which suggests even before 1908, and again, why this is such an important break is that before 1908, it's unlawful from the perspective of the Ottoman state for Armenians to return. So those who are returning before 1908 are doing so in under very difficult and challenging circumstances, because again, they're having to bypass the efforts of the state to prevent them from returning. The rates are still quite high, 15 to 20%, and I think that's a relatively conservative number. And again, people are returning for all sorts of reasons. I mean, the kind of individual cases that I found, and we have somebody like Ohannes Topalian who returns because he wishes to get married. Come across cases of people who get quite sick. And we have to remember that especially those who are migrating to the Northeast are working in dye factory tanneries, wire factories. These are extremely dangerous places that people are working in. So injury and illness is not an uncommon reason for people to return. I've come across instances of people who are divorced. So women who migrate to the United States to get married and then find that the situation is not so great and then return. But a key and major driver of return is the desire to come back and invest in land, open up a small shop. You've saved X amount of money while working abroad. That dollar stretches a lot further back in the Ottoman East. This is especially the case after 1908, when the Young Turk government lifts these restrictions and it becomes much easier to move back and forth. But even before, there's a desire to, I've gone abroad with this express purpose of saving money, of raising money to send back home and to eventually return. And so people return with that hope of buying a small plot of land, and that it's safe to do so.
So, the pull factors are certainly there, whether it's going back for marriage or to buy that piece of land or et cetera. I'm wondering if there are any push factors, prejudice, discrimination in the United States, that might have. I assume they came with a particular idea about what North America would be like, and then they are and think perhaps it's very different from the Ottoman Empire, and yet they're here and they're not welcome in many ways,
Right.
They're discriminated against. They can't buy land, let's say in Central California or whatever. So I'm wondering about the push factors too that might have pushed them to return.
Yeah, I think this is not something that I go into a lot of depth in the book. And so I think that this is something that for anybody who ends up reading the book and who is maybe looking for research angles, I see my book as a kind of contribution, opening some new angles for approaching this.
I know just the person too.
Right, exactly. This is a good question to address. Robert Myrack does it also to some degree. So I don't want to give a definitive answer, but rather I'll give an educated, based on my readings, based on my experience having researched this issue, is that whatever kinds of difficulties Armenians may have faced in the United States, they certainly understood, and particularly before 1908, that they were returning to also a very difficult environment in the Ottoman Empire, right? They might want to return home. The idea of returning to a place that they viewed as intrinsically their home, right? Both at an individual and emotional level, but also, of this is the place where Armenians belong. Nonetheless, they're returning to a very difficult environment in the Ottoman Empire, especially again pre-1908. Again, and those who are returning after 1908, they're not anticipating the catastrophe of the genocide. And that I think is really important to emphasize, that those who are coming back after 1908, when it seems that the political climate in the Ottoman Empire has gotten better, that they're not viewing, they're not anticipating the catastrophe that's going to come in 1915. Those who are returning again, but especially before 1908, whatever kind of challenges, difficulties they're facing in the United States, they're also facing similar kinds of challenges in the Ottoman Empire. So I think this defies a kind of not simple, that's unfair, but it defies a kind of singular sort of analysis that, some who have looked at, for example, Lebanese return migration have looked at this question of to what extent is anti-Arab sentiment in the United States impelling Lebanese migrants to return, and the argument is that a not unsubstantial number of people are returning exactly for that reason. I think in the Armenian case, I think a lot of research needs to be done to bear that out, because again, those who do return know that they're facing challenges when they return. They're not returning to a place of stability. So.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask one last question, but before I do, I'd like to ask our audience of 35 attendees, if you have a question, start sending your questions in through the Q&A button. Just write your question in and we'll try to get to it. So my last question actually is basically takes from where you left off, which is what happens to these returning migrants,
Mhm.
especially during the genocidal years. I mean, I know your book stops at 1915, but some of the actors, some of the historical actors that you dealt with, I wonder if you know if you can tell us what happened to them.
Yeah. So, and again, this gets back to this point of, it's important. We know what happens in 1915. Those who return before 1915 can't anticipate a catastrophe of that scale. Um, Nonetheless, of course, in 1915, and the Hartford region is one of the places most impacted. I mean, the sites of some of the worst, most catastrophic violence and destruction of the Armenian genocide. And I think again, a lot of that links to this issue that Armenians in the Hartford region had a degree of economic and political power that their contemporaries maybe further east didn't have. And one argument that I have is that it's exactly that degree, comparative degree of economic and political power that marks them, that marks them in 1915 as targets for some of the most horrific violence of the Armenian genocide. Many of those who find themselves caught up um, in the catastrophe of 1915 are either themselves naturalized American citizens who had returned, or they are the family members, so the dependent spouses and children of migrants who are living in the United States. And because this is an era in 1925, the United States passes a law that essentially divorces the citizenship status of a woman or a dependent child from their father or from their husband, so that citizenship itself becomes completely individual regardless of gender or age. Before the 1920s, if your father or husband is a citizen, you are a citizen as a result.
Mm-hmm.
So you also have large numbers of, again, spouses, dependent children who can claim American citizenship by dint of the fact that they have a father or a husband who is abroad, who is naturalized as an American citizen. And Leslie Davis, in this very famous account of the um, Armenian genocide in Harput Slaughterhouse Province, talks about having to turn away large numbers of people who laid claim to American citizenship. And the reason that he's forced to do this, and so he has people again who have naturalized as American citizens who are asking for protection as American citizens from Leslie Davis's office, from the American consulate, and he has to turn many of these people away because, again, they had returned without making the fact of their naturalization known. And under American State Department policy, and this was a policy that was only directed at Armenians. There wasn't this kind of policy was not directed against other migrant groups either in the Ottoman Empire or elsewhere in the world at the time. This was an outgrowth of diplomatic wrangling between the United States and the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And basically, the United States did this to mollify Ottoman concerns about the return of Armenians who had naturalized as American citizens. What the State Department directive said was that if you return without making the fact of your naturalization known to Ottoman authorities, you will have been assumed by the American diplomatic staff in the Ottoman Empire to have voluntarily forfeited your naturalization. And so in 1915, a lot of these people are not having their citizenship recognized. They do not have the protections of American citizenship extended to them exactly for this reason. And in fact, again, Leslie Davis talks about this, having to deny protection to people who are desperate for it in the context of the genocide. And so this has real dramatic consequences in the context of the Armenian genocide. There's a notable exception here. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this, Columbia University has opened up an entire library of Armenian oral histories. These are available for free to listen online at your leisure. So there are stories, these oral testimonies of genocide survivors. One that I listened to, done by a person named Oscar Kazanjian, who was born in the United States in 1909 to Armenian parents, who then returned to the Hartford region 1911, 1912. I think he may have been from Huseinig, just outside of Hartford, Mesre. Because he was a natural born American citizen, he, his younger brother, and his mother were granted protection by Leslie Davis, by the consul, because he was a natural born American citizen, and they could prove that he had been born in the United States. So his experience being a natural born American citizen was different than that of naturalized citizens. So again, the book also raises these questions of what citizenship means. In a world in which people are crossing borders. And this, again, has particular resonance not only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but also to the present day. So these questions of smuggling, citizenship, the meaning of citizenship that are important in the context of the book remain very significant into the 21st century. So the Armenian migration experience in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, I argue, provides, again, a lot of historical context for the world that we see today and the way in which migration is governed and migrants are treated on the international stage.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, David. I'm going to open it up to questions now, and we already have one question, so other people start asking questions. So Emil asks, in which states did most immigrants to the United States settle?
So many of these migrants in the late 19th, early 20th centuries are ending up in the American Northeast. So the majority end up in places like Worcester, Fitchburg, Providence, New York. But you do also have contingents who end up in places like Chicago. Of course, Fresno becomes less so, some for Harput migrants, but also from people from Merzaphon and elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire end up in Fresno. And there's a kind of different dynamic at play for those who end up in Fresno. It's much more agricultural migrants, people who hope to buy land in the Fresno area and work as agriculturalists, in stark contrast to those labor migrants who are going to places like Worcester and working in factories. So there's a multiplicity of experiences here. But the ones that I'm talking about, the Harpertsi migrants that I'm talking about, largely end up in the Northeast, in small to medium-sized factory industrial towns in the American Northeast.
Okay. So we have another question. This one from Colleen, which she apologizes from the beginning that it's a rather long question and brings me into it. I swear it was not on purpose. So where do the revolutionary political mobility networks that Professor Berberian explores in her book overlap with the economic or trade mobility networks that Professor Gutman explores? Overlap.
So I think from my perspective, the most salient overlap is not necessarily how these Armenian migrants themselves are interfacing with these political networks. Certainly, they are involved. The Hunchakian Revolutionary Party has numerous offices in the United States, or branches in the United States, as early as the early 1890s. The Dashnak Sutsuyun, by the late 1890s, has a significant presence in the United States. So certainly these migrants are interfacing with these political networks, are members of these political networks, as Robert Myrak talks about. In a sense, in the United States, at least, they kind of evolved by the first decade of the 20th century as much as like compatriot societies, as much as they are political organizations, for maintaining connections between Armenians living abroad and those living in the homeland. But I think the most salient connection is again, not how Armenians are interfacing, but how the Ottoman state views Armenian migrants, because the Ottoman state is extremely worried about the kind of border-crossing revolutionaries that Professor Berberian talks about very early on, trying to spy on their operations, trying to figure out where people are going, trying to prevent them from crossing borders, from becoming a political threat in the Ottoman Empire. And it's that concern about these transnational revolutionaries that begin emerging in the mid 1880s that then impels the Ottoman state to outlaw Armenian migration to North America, because from the perspective of the Ottoman state, the two phenomena are one and the same. Migration to North America and these political revolutionary networks are one and the same. And so, from the perspective of the Ottoman state, the only reason Armenians are migrating abroad is to radicalize while abroad, then return to the Ottoman Empire and sow discord. And in this way, the Ottoman state is, I call it, it's a degree of paranoia, because again, the evidence that's actually there does not suggest that that these Armenian migrants are the political threat that the Ottoman state conjures them up to be. Nonetheless, it's this concept of Armenian migration as inherently threatening that shapes the entire migratory process itself. And the Ottoman Empire is not alone in this, right? This is I see this as existing in parallel and in tandem with what the United States is doing, first with Chinese migrants in the early 1880s, and then broadening by the late 1890s into the first decade of the 20th century with the United States government response to Italian migration, or Eastern European Jewish migration or Middle Eastern migrations, seeing them as inherently threatening, assuming that all Italian migrants are anarchists that are looking to sow political discord in the United States. These are parallel discourses that are emerging both in the United States and the Ottoman Empire. And it's the ability of the Ottoman state to then harness this growing anti-immigrant discourse in the United States to then turn American policy against Armenian migrants when they return to the Ottoman Empire. So again, it's the Ottoman state is very aware and acutely aware of anti-immigrant discourse in the United States, and using that to exploiting that to their advantage, especially as regards to how Armenian migrants were treated, or their citizenship status was viewed by the United States when they returned.
So I think the second part of the question, in a sense, you sort of answered. While the Armenian groups, the mercantile or the migrant groups, and the revolutionaries had sort of different consciousness, class, or collective, or even mental geographies that were different, they were still seen the same way by the state, by the Ottoman state.
Right. So this question, the second question, or this not second question, this question about smuggling wealth from the Hartford region, smuggle their wealth. So,
could you read the question, or would you like me?
So it's
the audience can't see it. Yeah.
How did those who left from the Hartford region smuggle their wealth? And I think this is a great question, one that requires more research, but I have some tantalizing clues that lead back to this character, Arten Harputlian. And I have some, again, tantalizing evidence. I talk about it in the book. It's something that if somebody can find the sources for it, it would make a wonderful study. But it appears this Arten Harputlian, who had this large banking operation in the Harput region, he also had a banking branch in Istanbul. And then he was also connected, I mentioned his brother Miran, who lived in New York. And what seems to be happening here is that the way in which the Harputlian's organization collects on these debts is that they are then the conduit for money going back to the Harput region through their banking operation. So if you are a migrant living in Worcester and you traveled through the Harputlian smuggling network and you stop paying your debts, then Miran Harputlian can say, then I'm not going to help you send your money back home. I'm not going to help you send letters back home. If you want me to serve as a conduit for money going back to the Harput region, if you want to use our banking operations for that, you're also going to be paying up on your debts. Again, I have some tantalizing evidence this may have been the case, but that needs to be borne out by more research if it's possible. And again, this would not be too terribly different than the way that similar organizations, similar kinds of migrant connections worked both in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and also in the present day. By the second decade of the 20th century, you have Western Union becoming an increasingly large presence in the Ottoman Empire, and so you could send money back also through Western Union. But I think that these Armenian banking networks were in part how some of this money was repatriated.
So Silva asks if you could comment further on the migration to Fresno pre-genocide, and whether you know when and how the migration to Los Angeles began.
So the Fresno, I know a little bit about it, and it's not so much discussed in the book, but more from my recent travels to Fresno. There is a good book by about the Fresno Armenian experience by somebody named Berj Bulbulian, who recently passed away a few years ago. But the original Armenian migrants, end up in Fresno beginning in the early and mid 1880s. A lot of them are coming from Merziphone, so they were connected to the American Missionary College, Anatolia College in Merziphone. Then by the early 1890s, more Armenians. So a lot of the original Armenian settlers in Fresno were actually Protestants. A larger apostolic population begins to form, I think, in the early 1890s, especially as you have Armenians coming from elsewhere in the Ottoman East, including Hartford in the beginning of the early 1890s. My understanding is then it's that Fresno population that eventually seeds the Los Angeles Armenian community beginning in the early 20th century. So Fresno forms first, and then as perhaps people get sick of farming, get sick of growing fruit in the hot
Grapes.
fields of the Central Valley, they start going to LA as LA becomes more of a bustling metropolis beginning in the first decades of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. And it's actually the LA population is really increases in the 1970s.
Right.
So although there's an earlier wave, it's really in the 70s with the Lebanese Civil War and the Iranian Revolution and then the economic crises in Soviet Armenia that bring Armenians to the LA area.
Right, yeah, exactly. So that original smaller population was seeded. The initial sort of infrastructure for a bustling Armenian community in LA was seeded by those Fresno Armenians.
Yeah. So someone's asking, how did the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul approach the migration of Armenians out of the empire?
So I wasn't able to work in patriarchate sources, but there are a
Nobody
lot
is.
in the right. But there are a lot in the Ottoman archives. And by the early 20th century, the patriarchate becomes a critical body for Armenians to petition the Ottoman state for example, stays of deportation. So, and when I say the word deportation here, I'm separating it from the kind of genocide meaning in 1915, but rather Armenians who returned, especially in the first decade of the 20th century, before 1908, if they were found by Ottoman authorities to have returned illegally from the United States, they could face deportation from the Ottoman Empire. And the Armenian Patriarchate became a critical sort of support base for Armenians to plead their case with the Ottomans, to essentially plea for stays of deportation. So in many ways, at least the way that the evidence that I'm seeing is that the Armenian Patriarchate is in a sense trying to assist Armenians as a kind of communication node with the Ottoman state to prevent essentially bad outcomes as a result of these policies that the Ottoman state had employed against Armenian migrants.
Yeah. I remember, David, when I was doing my research in the periodical press in the Ottoman Empire, there were dozens of articles that that basically spoke against Armenian migration out of the empire, because I mean it was a dangerous thing to have the population become smaller and smaller.
Right, and I know, like, for example, the poet and playwright Tilga Dinsi writes considerably about. He was also opposed and very concerned about migration on a couple of fields. Part of it was worrying about it sapping the kind of energy of Armenians to protect and develop the homeland, but also, there's concerns about the Armenians becoming too much like Americans and sort of adopting the not serious consumer culture.
Even then, huh?
Even then, right? Even in the early 20th century, like,
Yeah.
why would we want to become like the Americans? Why would we want to adopt their styles? So,
Yeah, I think they were very. I mean, the community leadership, the Armenian community leadership, was actually very much aware of the difference between um, living in the Ottoman Empire versus living in North America or Europe. The
mhm,
chances of assimilation in those lands was very different from the Ottoman Empire, and we see the
mhm,
same thing in the 1920s and 1930s in the Middle East with the post-genocidal populations. They're really concerned about being lost,
mhm.
right? Armenians losing
Yep.
themselves in and assimilating. So I think those same concerns were there early on as
And
well.
you see that. I mean, that's also similar in the Jewish migration experience. Also, I mean, there's lots of
Absolutely.
parallels there. I want to bring up a real quick story that I think is quite interesting. There's a story that I talk about in the book from 1907 of a priest in Keri, which is north and east of Hartford. And many Karetzi Armenians end up in Brantford, Ontario, for example.
Mhm.
Um, but the a priest in Keri is accused by the governor of Erzurum. Keri is part of Erzurum province, for leading a large protest of Armenians who had returned from North America in front of the government building in Keri, protesting these deportations. Um, and so this correspondence raises concerns about people becoming really desperate and really wanting to collectively fight against this policy of deportation that
Mhm.
was especially enforced in the years leading up to 1908.
Mhm.
So again, the church is also, in a sense, or at least church officials are also serving as or endeavoring to protect returnees against these policies of the Ottoman state.
Yeah. So our next question is: did you find any unique information on Armenian women
Mhm.
during these migrations? If so, how were they affected in the U.S. and in the Ottoman Empire?
So the gender dynamics of Armenian migration in this period are quite interesting. In a sense, they kind of follow a pattern that for a long time was considered by migration historians to be conventional, in that you have sort of young men who go abroad first, get established abroad, and then maybe bring family over later, or maybe eventually return. But since more case studies of migration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries has in fact revealed a lot more diversity in the kind of gendered experience of migration. So as an example, Lebanese who are migrating in very large numbers at the same time in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you have a much larger number, for example, of people leaving what's now Lebanon and Syria, women who are leaving looking for economic opportunities abroad. That it doesn't, the late 19th, early 20th centuries, that migration does not follow always the same kind of what had to have been assumed the same standard gendered pattern. Nonetheless, in the Armenian case, it does follow this more gendered, more male pattern, especially if we compare it to the Lebanese case. However, beginning in 1896, and a part of the reason for this is again, the kind of Pandukt tradition of labor migration, regional labor migration within the Ottoman Empire that was often quite male, heavily male. Another thing, of course, is also these bans on Armenian migration made it that much more difficult to migrate. Period. In 1896, after the Hamidian massacres, the Ottoman state essentially opened up a loophole in migration law that allowed Armenians to migrate lawfully to the United States if they agreed to renounce their Ottoman nationality, and if they agreed to cut off all connection with their home communities, and if they agreed never to return. So if you essentially signed a document that said, I renounce my Ottoman nationality, I agree never to return, I'm cutting off all contact with my home community, then the Ottoman state would provide permission for somebody to migrate abroad. And again, this reveals what the real fear here is. The fear here isn't migration, it's return migration. The desire here is you're fine if you leave and never come back. What we're worried about is if you leave and you come back. This, after 1896, becomes a way in which many families, women, dependent children, end up migrating to the United States to reunify with husbands, fathers living in the United States, was migrating through this channel. Beginning in the early 20th century, the U.S. consulate in Hartford actually spends much of its time processing these legal migration requests. There is somebody who is working actually on, so part of this process included taking photographs of people who were migrating to North America. The Ottoman state actually took pictures of those who were granted legal permission to migrate. The goal being to keep these pictures on file so that if anybody tried to come back, a picture would be on file and it could be matched with that person, and that person then would be barred from re-entry. Zeynep Gürsel, who is an art historian at Rutgers, has undertaken this significant project. She's actually found many of these photographs in the Ottoman archives. And right now she's doing this large sort of multi-level project looking at these photographs, but also connecting them with families of the descendants living in the United States. So I'm very much looking forward to her project because it's going to essentially capture this other aspect of this migration story. You know, if I'm talking about the kind of illicit migration largely, she's looking at it from the angle of this legal migration that again is largely geared toward family reunification, and again is often women alone with children who are having to navigate this process.
We're actually hoping to have Zeynep here next year as things become normalized.
Let's hope they will.
Yeah, we were trying to get her in May, but that didn't work out. So I'm gonna have you take one more question, David. May I suggest Vahe Meoni's question? What was the role of politics in favoring emigration vis-a-vis returning?
So, from the perspective of the Ottoman state, I'm guessing, right? Or a favoring of desiring.
Why don't you answer it that way, and then he can chime in if that's not what he meant.
Sounds good. And this kind of gets back to what I was just talking about, these two different streams of migration. One being this illicit migration, in which at least the thought was, often from Armenian migrants themselves, but also from the Ottoman state, that those who leave will eventually come back. That is the migration that the Ottoman state especially feared. This this added policy that allowed for a legal migration stream gives you an idea that the Ottoman state was fine with Armenian migration as long as that migration was permanent, which again, if there are fewer, I wouldn't call it necessarily a genocidal mentality, right? But you can see where some of that is emerging in that, we're fine if they leave if they don't come back. We're fine if they leave if they're not going to come back and, not only engage in revolutionary politics, but even buy land, become more prosperous. Clearly, there was no desire on the part of the Ottoman state for that to happen well before the genocide. And so clearly, the Ottoman state was more than happy for people to leave if the idea was that they would never return. So that's what I think makes this story quite interesting, is that the concern isn't, again, about people leaving. There, again, in broader migration literature, there's often a discussion about states that are worried about people leaving. And the general assumption is states are worried about people leaving because they don't want to lose productive populations. Right? They don't want to give over populations that are productive, that are paying taxes to another country. Right? And so that's typically why states controlled out-migration in this period, in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The Ottoman case, it's very different, at least with the Armenians. It's very, very different. The concern is not about people leaving, losing a productive population. The Ottoman state doesn't mind that if Armenians are leaving permanently. The concern is entirely about return migration and the sense that Armenians pose an intrinsic and central and important threat to the survival of the Ottoman Empire, to its control over the provinces in the Ottoman East.
Great. Thank you so much, David. This has actually been very fun for me. I hope you as well. Our event ends at 6:15, so I'm actually ending exactly at 6:15. Is there anything else you want to add before I make one final announcement?
Well, I could say if I didn't get to your question here, feel free to email me, and I can email you a response if you're interested. My email address is david.gutman Gutman at mville.edu. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that I didn't get to here.
Great. Thank you very much, David. And just a reminder that our next virtual event is in about a month on May 28th, which is also actually Armenian Independence Day for the First Republic, 1918 to 1920. There, Professor Grigor and I will be talking with Dr. Shahinian about our new book project on Armenian women in Iran. So we hope that you will join us then as well. Thank you very much to all of you for attending. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Please stay well, stay safe, and stay sane.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.